Hello, today we're talking about images of disability. These are popular images, or we could call them discourses or preconceptions that people have about what disability actually means. So these will be common beliefs held by the young people that you work with in your youth clubs or community centres, the other staff, the parents of the children who come in. Pretty much most people, and possibly even yourselves, will sometimes buy into some of these very popular and popularised ideas of what it means to be a young person with a disability. The very first one we're going to talk about is symbolised by a picture that went around on the internet and went completely viral over the summer, so that pretty much half the world saw it. It's popularised by an image of the athlete Oscar Pistorius running beside a small child of about 3, and they're both running on running blades. The image has a slogan across the front of it which says, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude," which is a quote from another disabled athlete by the name of Scott Hamilton. Now, this particular image, and there is a link on your Moodle to a newspaper article discussing it, as I said, it went completely viral. It became incredibly popular. As soon as it was put up on the internet, it was getting tens of millions of hits within the matter of a couple of days, and to huge acclaim from the able-bodied community, who described this image as being completely inspirational. However, the disabled community had a very, very different reaction to this image, which became so popular, with many people finding it upsetting, distressing, discriminating, denying the reality of their disability, and generally promoting an idea that is very prevalent in society and expressing that through this image, which actually makes life extremely hard for a lot of disabled people of all ages. So to begin to take this image apart, what is so challenging about this image if you yourself have a disability? The very first thing we could look at is the slogan on the front of it. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. What does that actually mean? We're going to come back to this idea by the end. But in the very beginning, it's essentially saying, if you have something wrong with you, it's because you haven't used your magical mind to cure yourself yet. You've got a bad attitude. And many, many disabled people and disabled groups reacted with a lot of anger to this image, saying, I do not have a disability because I've got a bad attitude. I have a bad attitude because I have a disability. So I've earned the right to my bad attitude. Thank you very much. The second layer on which we can go down and dissect this image of the runner with the small child is the level at which it is presuming the possibility of an instant and easy answer to any disability. So we see an adult and a child running on a technological innovation, the idea of running blades that people who lack legs can use. And the bit that the image is very rapidly writing over is the class discourse that lies within the photograph, the extreme expense of the running blades in question being used, with each blade by itself costing approximately £4,000, so that even for an adult to own such equipment, they would need to be extremely wealthy. The idea of being able to provide such equipment for a small child who would be growing fast and probably needing them replaced every few months shows us an image of a child who would not just be middle class, but from an extremely wealthy background with very high levels of privilege to be able to provide her with such equipment. And this image did not supply this information to the viewer, who looks at it and goes, oh, even a little girl who has no legs can run. So there you go, problem solved. And in this image, we therefore see class privilege coming through very, very strongly, and the fact that this easy ability to overcome disability would not be actually available for everybody. But what is the upshot of it? The upshot of it becomes this idea that if you have a disability, you really only have a bad attitude. You don't need any support from society. You don't need any support from anyone else. You just need to get over your own bad attitude and see what you can do for yourself. Because someone else, somewhere else in the world, was able to run in the Olympics even though he had no legs. And this becomes very popularised in the press and very popularised in interactions between people with disabilities and the rest of society as we look at what happens on a day-to-day basis. This idea that people can simply get over it, get on with their lives, and that nothing is actually wrong. The third level of what is wrong with this image, however, and the one most discussed and described, is the idea whereby this is an image created by able-bodied people for consumption by other able-bodied people, using, without their consent, the images of people with disabilities to prove a point that's actually, underneath it all, got nothing to do with disability. And the name used popularly in the disability press for these kind of images, which are quite prolific, is the idea of inspiration porn. The idea that images can be created almost always using small children with some form of disability or other, perhaps painting with their mouth, perhaps painting with their toes, perhaps running on prosthetic limbs, always being presented as doing something that would actually be completely and utterly normal for another child of their age, completely developmentally appropriate and not at all astounding, but their disability is visible and their disability becomes what the picture is all about. These pictures aren't produced for people who are disabled, they're produced for people who are able-bodied to draw inspiration from, to self-manage their own emotions and to self-manage their own struggles in their own life, but while doing so, actually profoundly alter images and perceptions that people hold in their mind of actual, real disabled people. This brings us on to the next layer of images, which is this whole idea of disabled people constantly being in existence purely for the inspiration of able-bodied people. And in quite a linked image, the second image is the one where an interviewer is asking a man in a wheelchair, "Can I ask what it's like to be a tragic but brave member of society?" And the man in the wheelchair responds by saying back, "Only if I can ask you what it's like to be such a patronising bastard." And within this, we can begin to see how the reaction to this constant idea of disabled people existing for the inspiration of able-bodied people actually has its effect on the day-to-day life. The third layer from this, though, that we go on to, and we're now going to look at an image of a child in a wheelchair, a child in a very old-fashioned wheelchair with the slogan, "Gee, I wish I could play again." And this is the image of the disabled child as inherently tragic, there for the inspiration of able-bodied people, but in and of themselves almost always presented as always tragic and always sad. And again, these images are quite prolific. This is only one example. There was one up on Falconwood train station for practically a year of an extremely, extremely sad little boy, all greyed out, sitting in a wheelchair in a park with the message being that he couldn't actually play, which is in fact complete nonsense. Children in wheelchairs can play perfectly well in very, very many ways, but that's not so good as a fundraising strategy for the charity who want you to part with your money. So instead, they present the child as utterly tragic and utterly sad. And again, this image repeats itself in youth and community work practice over and over again. And many students buy into this discourse as the child or young person going to the youth club with some kind of a disability as always inevitably having a terribly sad life. Youth workers believe that the child with the disability, that the young person with the disability couldn't take part in any of the activities, couldn't join in, couldn't go to music festivals, couldn't do any of these normal things that other young people can do. When in actual fact, the child with the disability, the young person with the disability, is seldom blocked from doing any of these things. This is an idea which is profoundly cultural and yet profoundly strong and prevalent just about everywhere. So far we've seen that images of children and young people with disabilities in particular are deriving very strongly from this idea of the incredibly inspiring and wonderful, but also almost always very tragic and sad young person. However, there's another layer of images which is becoming increasingly more dominant in society over the last couple of years. And this is the idea of the disabled person as a scrounger, the disabled person as someone who wants something for nothing. In a very scary piece of research, it was revealed recently that 70% of people who live in the UK do not think that disabled parking spaces should exist because they believe that it gives disabled people an unfair advantage, that they're getting something for nothing. And what we see from this is that the press in particular have very much been driving this. And in the image where we see all the newspaper headlines that have been produced over the last couple of years, including disabled benefit, just fill in a form, 75% on the sick are skiving, 75% of incapacity claimants are fit for work. And this image comes up over and over and over again. The people who claim to have disabilities probably don't really have disabilities. They've just got a bad attitude. They just need to try harder. They're just trying to get something for nothing from everybody else. And this idea is certainly very much on the rise, as an awful lot of research has proven. It is closely linked to the rise of hate crime, which we know has been shooting up in the same time that these newspaper headlines are becoming more and more popular, so that we also have a 70% rise in reported instances of hate crime against disabled people in the same time that we have a similar rise in these kind of headlines. So we can now see that there's another layer to this idea of disabled people as not only being profoundly inspiring but very tragic, but also as being questionable, maybe just playing it on, maybe just looking for something for nothing, maybe being a drain on resources that the country doesn't have to give, or that the youth club doesn't have to give. So maybe it would be better if they just went away. And again, this discourse is something that is held to quite a large extent pretty much everywhere you go, and we see it all the time. The final discourse that I want to talk about is the one that relates to the idea of children and young people with disabilities as being inherently curable and inherently the business of medicine. And there are many images that we can draw on here that are available all over the internet, all over the press. We see them all the time. And one in particular we see where there is an image of some children on walking sticks, struggling to walk. And then underneath it says, prayer, and it shows a family praying, and then underneath it shows the same children still on walking sticks. And then in the next set of images held up beside that, we see the children on walking sticks, and then science, and then it shows you some secondary school children doing some research in a science lab, and then underneath that it shows you a completely different group of children running and playing happily. Their disability has been completely cured. And this is, again, a very typical image that we see all the time. And it is also an image that reflects a profound level of belief that affects youth and community work practice towards people with disabilities. And it is the belief in, essentially, what we could describe as the magic of medicine. Because if we unpick these images, what is actually being said? It's being said that if a person has a disability and they go to the doctor and the doctor carries out some science on them, they will instantly be cured and they will no longer have a disability. Is this what people really believe? Think about the conversations that you yourselves have had in class about a young person with ADHD in the youth club, and should they not go to the doctor and get a diagnosis so that everything can be fixed? I would suggest that these ideas are very strong, very dominant, and that many, many people hold them. But are they true? How many disabilities have been cured by science? Can anyone name one? I can give you some clues as to where you could start looking. Polio has been prevented, and the children in this image we're discussing look like they could quite probably be children who were disabled by polio. Polio has been prevented, but it hasn't been cured. A child who did have polio to this day could still not be prevented from actually being disabled, and the disability that had set in couldn't be reversed. We have simply, however, managed to ensure that not as many people have polio in the future through inoculations. Some progress has been made on conditions such as spina bifida, where we now know more than we used to know about preventing as many children being born with the condition. However, where a child is still born with the condition, there is no such thing as a cure. That child, if they're born with a disability, will have a disability. And in fact, from there on, as we go through it, we discover that while medicine has been very good in many ways at curing illness, it's been very, very poor at being able to do anything about disability. It can't grow back limbs, it can't grow back damaged spines, it can't recreate sight or hearing that has been lost, and disability isn't particularly curable. And yet we live in a society which presumes that disability is curable. And this brings us back full circle to that very first image, where we're told the only disability in life is a bad attitude, because these beliefs are actually prevalent. These beliefs are actually out there all the time, and youth workers operate on the assumption of them. If there is a child with a disability in the youth club, the solution is send them to the doctor for a cure. If they're not actively being cured, they've got a bad attitude, they're not trying hard enough. They need to try harder, and they can come back into the youth club when they're cured, when their ADHD has been made to go away, when their Asperger's syndrome has been drugged out of existence. That's when we'll work with them. Whereas in actual fact, that has little to no reflection on the reality of the life of the young person with a disability. So to finish up, we see that this idea of magical medicine is very, very prevalent. Many youth workers hold to it, many parents hold to it, many other young people hold to it, but it does not actually have validity. And it can, in fact, be a very, very damaging discourse that allows for very high levels of exclusion of young people with disabilities of all kinds of types from not only the youth or community centre, but from schools and society at large.